In 735, disease entered Japan through the fishing villages of northern Kyushu. No one knew this was the beginning. People fell ill, died, buried their neighbors, and thought, it will pass. But the disease did not pass. It moved deeper into the country, along roads, trade routes, through messengers and pilgrims. By 737, there was no place left on the islands that it had not touched. When it was over, a third of Japan's population was dead. This is not a legend. It is a documented fact. The smallpox epidemic of 735 to 737 became one of the most terrible catastrophes in the country's history. But its significance cannot be reduced to numbers alone. This is a story about how disease can break not only people, but also a state. How fear becomes part of culture, and how a society that cannot explain an invisible threat begins to look for answers where there are none, in rituals, taboos, and symbols. Japan at that time was a young, centralized state. Only a few decades had passed since an imperial system of government, modeled on Tang China, had been established there. The capital, Nara, shone with new temples. Officials kept records of subjects, land, and taxes, and the Buddhist clergy occupied an increasingly prominent place at court. The country was being built, and it was at this very moment that smallpox arrived. The disease entered Japan through Kyushu, the western island closest to the Korean coast. According to the most widespread version, the virus was brought by a Japanese traveler returning from the continent. From Kyushu, the disease spread along the administrative roads that connected the provinces with the center. This is a cruel irony. The very infrastructure the state had built for control and administration became the main route of contagion. By 736, the disease had reached the central regions of Honshu. By 737, it had become a catastrophe on the scale of the entire state. Peasants, craftsmen, monks, officials, and aristocrats were dying. Fields stood empty. Tax revenues collapsed. The government recorded people's deaths, but could neither explain the cause nor stop the spread. Chronicles of the time contain entries that today read like evidence of total bewilderment. Decrees ordering prayer services, commands to build new altars, directives to distribute rice to the starving. The state did what it could, but the disease paid no attention. Among the victims of 737 were 4 brothers of the powerful Fujiwara clan. Fujiwara no Muchimaro, Fusasaki, Umakai, and Maro. All 4 died within a few months. This was not merely a family tragedy, it was a political blow. By that time, the Fujiwara clan held key positions at court, and the simultaneous death of 4 influential officials exposed just how fragile the structure of power really was. Disease made no distinction between an ordinary farmer and a man making decisions of state. That is precisely one of the main effects of an epidemic. It destroys the hierarchy of fear. In ordinary times, a man of low status fears his lord. In an epidemic, the lord fears the same thing as the peasant. Disease equalizes, and this equalization creates a special social climate: panic, confusion, and an acute need for explanation. In 8th century Japan, such explanations were sought in several directions at once. Buddhist monks recited sutras and performed purification rituals. Courtiers organized prayer services. At the regional level, people turned to local practices of protection against illness, to amulets, apotropaic signs on gates, and special rites passed down within the community. None of these means stopped the virus, but each helped people endure fear.
and in the conditions of an epidemic, that is no less important than medicine. Buddhism held a special place in Japanese life during this period. It had entered the country from Korea and China around the 6th century, and by the 8th century it had become the state religion.
In the Buddhist worldview, disease was perceived as a consequence of a disturbance in order, accumulated karma, or insufficient attention to spiritual life. This meant that treatment had to be not only physical, but also spiritual. Monks recited the Sutra of Golden Light, which, according to the beliefs of the time, protected the state from calamities. Temples and monasteries were built partly in response precisely to the threat of disease. This connection between epidemic and Buddhist construction is very clearly visible in the chronicles. The great Buddha of Nara, the famous Daibutsu in Todaiji Temple, was commissioned by Emperor Shomu during this very period. According to one interpretation, its construction became a response to a series of catastrophes, including the epidemic of 735 to 737. The state was translating fear into monumental form. The colossal bronze figure rising above Nara was at once a religious object and an answer to what seemed insurmountable. Smallpox did not disappear after 737. It returned, again and again. Researchers studying the history of epidemics in Japan have calculated that for several centuries, smallpox outbreaks recurred roughly every few years. This meant that every generation encountered the disease, and fear of it was not a historical memory, but a living experience. Over time, the culture developed a special relationship to smallpox. It was terrifying, inevitable, and required special ritual treatment. A special role in this culture was played by so-called protective images. In different periods of Japanese history, people used depictions that, in their view, drove illness away or appeased it. One such figure was Amano-jaku, a demon-like being whose image was placed on house gates during epidemics. In the Edo period, when smallpox remained dangerous, bright red images were used and attributed protective power. In Japanese tradition, the color red was associated with warding off disease. Some historians connect this with the observation that red light irritated the skin less during smallpox eruptions, something that may have laid the foundation for this color symbolism long before anyone could explain it physiologically. In the late Middle Ages and the Edo period, an entire layer of folk culture connected with disease took shape in Japan. Special songs were sung during epidemics, rituals were performed to drive illness out of the village, and straw figures were made to carry the contagion beyond the settlement. In this culture, disease was both feared and appeased, expelled and implored to leave. This was not superstition in a dismissive sense. It was a way of preserving collective calm in conditions where no rational answer to the threat existed. It is important to understand that Japanese medicine of the time did exist and function. Already in the 7th and 8th centuries, remedies based on Chinese medical tradition were known in the country. There were texts describing diseases, their symptoms, and methods of treatment. In some provinces, officials kept records of the sick. But practice and theory were separated by a vast distance. Knowledge of disease was concentrated in the hands of a narrow elite, while most of the population relied on what was available: the experience of elders, village healers, ritual, and prayer. This does not mean people were helpless. It means their tools were different. One practical response to epidemic disease was isolationist behavior. Sources record cases in which families shut themselves inside their homes, villages refused to admit travelers, and officials did not dare enter disease-stricken areas. This was not organized quarantine in the modern sense, but it was an instinctive response to the contagiousness of disease developed through observation. In conditions where the state could not provide centralized protection, An individual family or village acted as best it could. Measles, which appeared in Japan later, and also swept through the country in several major waves, aroused similar fear. In the 11th and 12th centuries, during the Heian period, measles epidemics killed people, even at the most refined court in Japanese history. Heian culture meant exquisite poetry, intricate court life, layered garments, and elaborate etiquette. And at the same time, it was an age in which imperial consorts died of illness. High-ranking courtiers suddenly vanished from life, and beauty and death stood very close together. In the famous Sarashina diary, disease is mentioned as something ordinary and unavoidable. It is an eloquent document. Fear is not described directly there. It simply lives inside the text. At the end of the 12th and beginning of the 13th century, Japan experienced a period of civil wars and political upheaval. Military clans fought for power, the capital changed hands several times, and famine and epidemics walked alongside war. During this period, Buddhist preachers such as Honen and later Shinran offered people new paths to salvation, simpler, more accessible, and not requiring complex rituals or monastic learning. Their success was linked in part to the fact that ordinary people, having lost loved ones to disease and war, needed consolation they could understand. Epidemics nourished religious movements, and those movements, in turn, changed Japanese society. By the Edo period, that is, the 17th through 19th centuries, Japan had learned to cope with smallpox somewhat better. The practice of variolation, deliberate infection with a weakened form of the virus, had appeared. This practice came from China and gradually spread among the educated strata of the population. When information about Jenner's European method of vaccination reached Japan in the early 19th century, it was received with interest. In 1849, a Western smallpox vaccine was first used in Nagasaki. This was one of the first cases in which Japan was not simply receiving medical knowledge from China, but turning to European experience. The disease that had tormented the country for more than 1,000 years had finally met a real means of protection. But the road to vaccination was long, and throughout that entire road, the disease lived not only in people's bodies, but also in their ideas about the world. It entered folk songs and rituals. It determined what images people hung on house gates. It explained why, in some villages, strangers were not accepted for certain periods of time. It became part of everyday knowledge about how the world worked, a world in which one could suddenly die without understanding why. This is precisely the historical truth of epidemics in medieval Japan. Disease was never only a medical fact, it was a cultural event. It changed people's behavior, their beliefs, their architecture, and their politics. The state, built according to the Chinese model, was forced to react to a threat that no roads and no accounting system could stop. The religion that had come from the continent found new followers with every wave of disease. Folk practices that seemed strange when viewed from a distance were an exact response to a concrete experience of fear and helplessness. Smallpox disappeared from Japan not as a relic of backwardness. It disappeared only when medicine learned how to defeat it. Until that moment, people did what they could. They treated the sick, prayed, shut their gates, built temples, painted protective symbols, sang ritual songs, and again buried their neighbors. It was not a victory over disease, it was survival under conditions in which victory was impossible. And perhaps that is what makes the history of epidemics in Japan truly heavy. Not the mortality figures themselves, not the destruction of the state apparatus, but the fact that for more than 1,000 years people knew the disease would return. Not someday, but soon. Perhaps this very year. Perhaps your child. Perhaps you. And at the same time, life had to go on. Rice had to be planted, taxes had to be paid, houses had to be built, and meaning had to be found in what was happening. Fear that lives that long ceases to be sharp. It becomes the background. And the background, as we know, changes a person more deeply than any single blow.